Just going to be doing a couple of verses. Jeremiah 16:19 will be one, and Galatians 1:2 will be another. I was kind of wondering what exactly to teach on this morning, because obviously it is St. Patrick's Day, and we've heard the story of St. Patrick so many times. So I was wondering, okay, how can I make this unique? How can I make it at least slightly different from what we normally hear on St. Patrick's messages? So I thought about doing St. Patrick's Confession, which was basically his autobiography. It's actually not that long. It's maybe a few pages long, maybe 10 pages long. It's not that long of an autobiography. I thought about kind of doing the story of St. Patrick again, go the safe route. I thought, you know what would be interesting is giving the history of England and by extension Ireland. So the history of Ireland starting back into maybe the 4th century BC. So I thought that would be pretty interesting. So I looked into some of the history of 4th century Ireland and the history of how it's developed from that point. And so I think we'll go into that. The Jeremiah 16:19 verse, which we'll start with. Let me get there. Jeremiah 16:19. This is one of the verses that Patrick used in his autobiography, saying this is one of the verses that convicted him to go to Ireland. So let's go to Jeremiah 16. 16, verse 19. So this is obviously Jeremiah 16. It's talking about Judah specifically, but in practical application, you can use the wisdom from the past to apply it to your own situation. And that's what Patrick did in the 5th century AD is when he was being a missionary to Ireland. He was a British native, and he was captured by the Irish, lived there for a number of years. He was a slave of the Irish for a number of years. He escaped back to England and lived there for a number of years, but then God convicted him to go back to Ireland and preach to the same people, preach Christ to the same people that had enslaved him. And so he did. And Jeremiah 16:19 was one of the verses that God used to convict him of that. So let's read verse 19. Jeremiah is saying, O Lord, my strength and my fortress, and my refuge in the day of affliction, the Gentiles, the nations, shall come unto thee from the ends of the earth, and shall say, surely our fathers have inherited lies, vanity, and things wherein there is no profit. Shall a man make gods unto himself, and they are no gods? Therefore, behold, I will this once cause them to know. I will cause them to know mine hand and my might, and they shall know that my name is the Lord. This verse is what Patrick used, or he recalled this passage from the scripture, and thought that enough of a conviction to bring him back to Ireland to preach to the nations that had enslaved him. And in his moment of conviction, in his dreams, God was giving him these convictions to go to the Irish because they were the nations coming to him and saying, what can we, or how can we know of your God? We've inherited lies, we've inherited these idols, and we need to know your God. And so that was the dream that God gave to him. The Irish were calling to him, and he went back to them to preach Christ. And so that's the verse that the verse says that God used as a convicting moment for Patrick. And so let's go then to Galatians 1. All right, Galatians 1. If you have a study Bible, it'll give you a bit of a background on the book of Galatians. I don't know if you have that, or if you have the same kind of study notes that I do. But in my study Bible, there's a paragraph at the beginning of the book of Galatians that says, "This book is called Pros Galatas, to the Galatians, and it is the only letter of Paul that is specifically addressed to a number of churches." In verse 2, "And all the brethren which are with me, unto the churches of Galatia." The name Galatians was given to this Celtic people because they originally lived in Gaul before their migration to Asia Minor. The Galatians were Gauls, Galatia. That's how they got the name. So the Galatians were a Celtic people, the Gaulish people. So Gaul and Celt are actually refer to the same people. It's just Gaul was their own name for themselves, and Celt was the Roman name for them. So the Romans called the Gauls the Celts. Now the Gauls were originally from kind of what we call France and Spain. So basically what we call France is where the Gauls originated as a nation, a group of tribes. And they didn't exactly have an empire, but they were very widespread. They migrated out all over the place along the coasts of Europe. So they went south and east through Rome and Greece and Asia Minor. And they settled in Asia Minor and became known to the Greeks and to the Romans as the Gauls So the Gauls in that region were called the Galatians. The Gauls from France also migrated north into the islands north of Gaul. So what are the islands north of Gaul? It's what we call the British Isles. So you have Britain, Scotland, which is north of that, and then Ireland is another island off of Britain. So you have the Gauls, which migrated all over the place. They weren't exactly an empire, but they were just all over the place. So the Romans knew them as the Galatians, but then they had also settled in the islands north of what we call France. So that's the Gauls. The Romans had a lot of problems with the Gauls because the Gauls were basically barbaric. They were barbaric migrants that went all over the place, and the Romans had a hard time keeping them subjugated. The Romans had brought peace to the entirety of Europe and southern Europe and northern Africa, but the Gauls were just a thorn in their side. They couldn't subjugate the Gauls, so they called the Gauls in Asia Minor, they called them Galatians. The ones further north in the British Isles, they were also Gauls, but the Roman name for them was the Celts. Is this a little bit loud? It feels a little bit loud to me. So anyway, you have the Celtic, or the name the Celts was given to the Gaulish people of mainland Europe. Those that were in the islands, the British or the Romans didn't really think much of them until they began to conquer the Celts in Britain. So Rome began to conquer Britain in the 1st century AD, and that's how they kept them. So the British Isles, which were called Britain from a very long time ago, Briton. Today we think of it as Britain, but back then they called it Briton. So the Gauls, the ancient nation where France now is, they were powerful in the 4th and 3rd century BC. They spanned the coasts from England to Asia Minor. The Romans conquered them and called them Celts. The Greeks, before the Romans, the Greeks called the island that the Gauls inhabited, so the North Islands that the Gauls inhabited, they were called the Prytanoi, which means the tattooed people. So the original native inhabitants of Britain called Britanoi by the Greeks. That was then changed to Britain by the Romans. So the Romans called the islands Brittany and occupied them from 43 AD to the 5th century AD. So the 5th century, right around 400 something, that's when Rome started collapsing. Rome also united with the Roman Catholic Church. They had gotten super powerful, but overextended, and then they started collapsing from inward corruption. From the inward collapse, there was also this division in Rome between the Western Romans, which retains the name Rome, and the Eastern Romans, which were called Greeks. Even though Greek was a long dead empire at that point, they called themselves Greeks, and so the Greek Romans then changed their name to the Byzantines. So there you had that split around 300 to 400, and so in these final 100 years of Rome's history, you have the split between the Greeks, known as the Byzantines, and the Westerns, known as the Romans. Then Germanic tribes started attacking from the north. You've heard of the Goths, you've heard of the Vandals. Those are the barbaric German tribes that came from the north going south into the collapsing Roman Empire. There were also at the same time, there was also a German tribe called the Saxons that saw that Rome was failing. They were collapsing as a nation, as an empire. And so the Saxons, they crossed the narrow strait between Northern Europe and the islands. We call that narrow strait the Strait of Dover. But the word for strait or narrow, the Old Germanic word for strait is angul. So you have angul, that word itself referring to the strait between Northern Europe and the islands was then added as a prefix to the Saxons. So the Saxons were the Germanic tribe in Northern Europe, and then from that point, the strait between those two, the water that divided those two was added to Saxon as a distinguisher between the mainland Saxons and the island Saxons. So the island Saxons were then called the Angul Saxons or Anglo-Saxons. And they are the Germanic tribe that conquered England, or what I guess for now we should call it Brittany. They conquered Brittany as the other Germanic tribes were conquering the main part of Rome down in Italy. So now that you have the Gaulish people, the Celts that inhabit these two major islands, the two islands are basically called Brittany at this point. They are Celtic people, and the mainland or the large island was then conquered by the Anglo-Saxons. They were conquered by the Saxons, and then Anglo was added to distinguish them from the mainland Saxons. So now you have the Gaulish people or the Celtic people that are now mixing with the Anglo-Saxons in the southern part of the main island. The Scots retains a bit of their independence. I don't want to use the word independence because that's kind of a modern political idea. They retained their autonomy, retains their separation from the Anglo-Saxons in the south. And for hundreds of years onward, the northern part of Brittany and the western island, which at that time was called Erin. So those two portions of Brittany were not able to be conquered by the Anglos, by the Saxons. And so there was just this constant warfare between the Anglo-Saxons, the Anglo-Saxon Celts, and then the native Celts of Erin and what came to be known as Scotland, the north. So after that point, the Germanic Goths and Vandals and Saxons basically ransacked all of Roman territory. Then, let's see, where am I in my notes? Saxons, Anglo-Saxon, Celts. Around this time, so the early 5th century, about, let's say, 410 AD, is when Rome fell as an empire, well, began falling as an empire, and the Germanic tribes started taking over their territories, Italy in the south and Brittany in the north. Right around this time, 410 is when Rome fell, and then around 450, 460 is when Patrick was born. And as a teenager, he was captured by the Celts of Erin and went to that island and lived as a slave there for some time. And then he escaped back to Brittany. He escaped back to the Saxon Britain, the Britons. And that's when he lived his life. And then he got a call from God to go back to Erin and evangelize to them. And at that point is when Erin became Christian. Very shortly after Patrick went to Erin as a missionary, it was not long before basically the entire island had converted to Christianity. Now, at this point, obviously you have the church-wise. Obviously you have the Western Church, which is known as the Roman Catholic, and then the Eastern Church, which is known as the Byzantines. Obviously, throughout Europe and including the Britons, the version of Christianity that existed throughout most of Europe was Roman. It was the Roman Catholic Church. So you had Brittany was Catholic, and then when Patrick went to Ireland or went to Erin, that was also Catholic. It was really the only version of Christianity that existed in Europe. In Eastern Europe, in parts of Asia, the near parts of Asia, they became Byzantine, and they were also considered Catholic, but they weren't Roman Catholic. So you had Roman Catholic and Byzantine Catholic, and there was just kind of this political enmity between them. They didn't have a whole lot of warfare fights between them, but it was just a lot of political disagreements, some religious disagreements. It wasn't until 1000, maybe 1100 AD, that Rome was starting to collect more and more power, more and more centralized power in Rome itself. And all of Europe had basically united under Rome. And the Eastern Church was telling the Western Church, you do not have any power over us over here. Each region is governed religiously by a bishop, by a patriarch, by a father, by a overseer, pastor, whatever word you want to use. They were each region had its own overseer, and the Eastern Church was telling the Western Church, we don't accept your universal authority. We are under our own overseers, our own bishops. And at that point is when the Catholic schism between the East and the West happened. And so then you have the Orthodox and the Catholic. So at this point, Europe is Catholic, and Asia Minor and Eastern Europe is Byzantine. And at that point, they had just kind of adopted the name Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Byzantine Orthodox. That's kind of that political situation there. Anyway, in Europe, you have Catholics. So that was about 1000 to 1100 AD. And then it wasn't for another 500 years that individual priests within the Catholic Church were starting to say, hey, the Catholic Church is developing these doctrines. They're inventing these new doctrines that are nowhere in the Bible. The idea that you can do penance or certain actions to reduce your time in purgatory. In fact, purgatory itself is an invention. And all these doctrines about Mary, some of the Catholic priests were starting to realize, wait, a lot of this stuff that we're learning in school is not in the Bible. Why is that the case? And they started investigating it, and they started realizing, wait a minute, the Catholic Church has been inventing stuff, making human traditions that do not comport with the Bible. They are invented out of whole cloth. And so these priests were kind of the first wave of leaders, church leaders, that started saying, the church is going astray. It is inventing stuff. We need to go back to our roots as Christians. We need to get rid of these extraneous doctrines and just go back to what's in the Bible. And so that movement of religious leaders saying, we need to reform the doctrine, we need to reform the church. We cannot continue the way we've been going. We need to reform it and go back to original Christianity. What they were doing was they were protesting the inventions, protesting the abuses of the Catholic Church, and saying we need to go back to original Christianity. So they were called both the Reformers and the Protestants, two words referring to basically the same thing. So anyway, during this major movement in the 1500s, kind of starting or gaining traction in the 1400s, really getting speed in the 1500s, you had this Protestant movement against the Catholic Church saying, we no longer accept these doctrines that you have invented. We need to go back to the original version of the Bible, or we need to go back to the Bible, cast off all of these invented doctrines. And so you had movements in various regions. This movement started spreading. And so in Germany, the movement was started by, in Germany specifically, it was Luther. In Brittany, which at this point, because of the Saxon invasion of Brittany and then the French Norman invasion of the Anglo-Saxons, the Normans combined with the Saxons eventually became the English. The reason they're called English is because you had the Saxons in the mainland Europe, and the Anglo-Saxons on the island. Anglo referring to the water division between them. Then the Normans conquered them, and so the Normans, they were French. So the name that was used to distinguish the mainland Normans from the island Normans was, again, Anglo. And at that point, it was changed from Anglo to English. So English and French were then the two names used to distinguish the mainland from the island. So now you have Celtic origins, Germanic invasion, and then the Roman Norman invasion. So a combination of those three eventually became English. And that's why we often joke that English is a mutt language, because it is. It has Celtic origins back 2,000 years, and then Germanic roots 1,600 years ago, and then also Roman roots from 1,000 years ago. So the combination of those languages is what made up English as a language. So anyway, you have those people. So you have the Lutherans in Germany. You have the Dutch Reformed in the Netherlands. You have these various movements in these various regions and countries getting their own version of saying, we reject the Catholic authority and we are going back to the Bible. So each of these denominations, they are saying, we reject the overall authority of the Catholic Church, and we reject the overall authority, and we also reject the doctrinal inventions of the Catholic Church, such as purgatory and Mary worship, icon veneration, those kinds of things, and they went back to the Bible. But they still kept the high church, or they kept the liturgy that the Catholic Church had also developed. So the practices of church, the practical practices of the church, they kept, but the doctrinal inventions they shed. So that's why you have a lot of Lutherans and Dutch Reformed, Presbyterians. Presbyterians kind of originated in Scotland. They were an offshoot of the Anglicans. So, and then you have Anglican, which was the English, the Anglo protest. So the Protestant movement, when it made its way into England, was called Anglican. And then the northern version of that was Presbyterians, which came from Scotland. So Scotland had Presbyterians, and mainland England had the Anglican Protestant. So anyway, how does this all tie back to Ireland? So Ireland, England, they've been Catholic for 1,000 years at this point. And anytime there is a change that happens to mainland, or anytime there's a change that happens to the greater portion of Britain, the Irish island resists that same change. So you had the Celts that were the native inhabitants. The Saxons came into, they crossed the Anglo Strait and conquered Brittany. They conquered the mainland part of it, the large island, but the small island resisted that. And so they remained fairly independent, but there was still this constant warfare between them. Then when the Normans invaded the Anglo-Saxons, they became a new people, but the Aryan inhabitants, the Irish, they also resisted that. So that explains why English as a nation or English as a language has developed from its Celtic roots, its Celtic origins, and had Germanic influence and then also Roman influence, to the point that we don't really recognize any original Celtic words in English. There are some, but not a lot. But that's also why, or Erin being a small island and being a ferocious people, that's why they were able to remain distinct from mainland England, or the large part of the island, because each change that happened to the large part of the island, it was just not worth it for those invaders to continue on to Ireland, because at the point of conquering England, they were weakened from the battle, but then the same people group, the same tribes, the same Celts that fought them so viciously on England also fought them viciously on Ireland. It was a small island, and it just wasn't worth it for them to try to conquer the small island off of England. So that's why the Irish have been able to retain their distinct Celtic culture for thousands of years, as opposed to English, which has changed quite a lot over these past 2,000 years. So English, around the time that St. Patrick, the Saxon conqueror of Brittany, English wouldn't exist for another 600 years until the French Normans invaded the Saxons. Ireland had been a difficult place for invaders to get to next because of the size and ferocity of the people, the size of the island and the ferocity of the people. So after Patrick converted the Irish, obviously they were Catholic because that was really the only thing that existed. The British and the Irish warred for hundreds of years because each change that Britain underwent, they tried to pass on to Erin, but the Irish would resist that change each and every time. So each time a change happened to Britain, they tried to pass it on to Ireland, but they just wouldn't have anything of it. The only change, the only significant change that happened to the Irish people was their conversion to Christianity. And it was not through conquest, it was through Patrick's missionary work evangelizing the people. He didn't conquer them, he went to them and preached the gospel. That was all he did, and a nation was converted because of his missionary work. And so they had been Christian the Irish have been Christian from the 5th century, and they resisted conquering, they resisted political change as the Saxons tried to go into Ireland. The Saxons couldn't defeat them. When the Normans conquered the Saxons, the Normans tried going into Ireland, and again, they resisted it. And then when the Protestants, or when England became Protestant, they tried passing that change onto Ireland, but they also resisted that change. And that's where you have the tense religious, not exactly a war, there were wars, but dispute, the tense religious dispute between the Irish and the English, between the Catholic and the Protestant. England was Protestant and Ireland was Catholic, and you had that tense disagreement there, that enmity between them, Catholic and Protestant. Then you had around in the late 1600s, Scotland was starting to also have war with England. Like, there was just constantly stuff going on between that. But Erin, or Ireland's national color, was green. There was a conqueror, there was a king called William of Orange that started gaining political power, and he defeated King James II in 1688. And that is when a new national color started being proposed, orange. William of Orange was then represented by orange. So that those two colors represented Catholic and Protestant. William of Orange was Protestant, and the Irish were normally Catholic. So the orange and the green then was representative of this dispute between the Catholics and the Protestants. Green was Catholic and orange was Protestant. And that's Beth mentioned it at the beginning of this. There's kind of a silly song called the Greatest Mix-Up, where a Catholic and a Protestant have a child together and they can't agree on how to raise the child because they're Catholic and Protestant. So it's just kind of a silly song for the Irish, but it represents their internal cultural battle between Catholic and Protestant, orange and green. It's just very different within them. And I can't remember the date of the unification, the peace treaty. I think one of the names that it goes by is the parting of the ways. At least that's what I've gathered from songs that I listen to, but I can't remember the date. But there was a peace treaty between the Catholic and the Protestant, between the orange and the green. Now, what color represents peace? Everybody knows that's white. So you have green, white, and orange are the three colors that represent Ireland as a people, as a nation. And that's why their flag is green, white, and orange. It represents the unity between the Catholics and the Protestants, between the Irish Catholic, the Irish Protestant. They finally agreed to stop fighting. They unified, they have peace with each other, and that was represented by the white in their current flag. And I believe that kind of gives a summary of 2,000, maybe, 2,400 years of history in 40-ish minutes. So I hope that was interesting for you guys to listen to, as it was for me to look into. But that's the history of Ireland, including a little bit of Roman history, Saxon stuff, a brief mention of St. Patrick, Christianity, and all of their influences on Ireland as a nation. So if you have Irish heritage, well, it doesn't really matter if you do or you don't. It's nice to learn history anyway. But with that, let's close in prayer. Lord, thank you for today. I thank you for giving us history to learn from, whether it is for a purpose, whether we do it for a purpose to learn something specific and gain something from it, or whether it is simply fascinating. I thank you for history and letting us understand why people are the way they are because of their history, their nation's history, their ancestors' history. It determines how they are, what they're like. And one thing that we can learn from the story of Ireland, how they've been fiercely independent from any of the changes that happened to mainland Britain, we saw that the one organic change that happened to them was the spread of Christianity by Patrick preaching the gospel. As Ireland resisted every other change that England tried to force on them, the one organic change that they allowed was done through a peaceful preaching of the gospel, not a conquering, but a peaceful preaching of the gospel. And I pray you would give us strength to realize the power of the preaching of the gospel in peace. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. We are dismissed.